fine. Vamos pedir a todos que vamos começar de imediato. Vamos só pedir a todos, e vou fazer isto em português por uma questão de simplicidade e de não roubar tempo à nossa interação. Vamos pedir a todos que mudem os microfones, silenciem os microfones, está bem? Durante a sessão, que é a maneira de nós garantirmos então que fica o canal aberto para conversarmos. Vai haver momentos de interação, é isto, sintam-se à vontade. Sei que vai haver, portanto, preparem-se para isso, alguns momentos que se vai recorrer ao Mentimeter e, portanto, se quiserem abrir o menti.com, eu não sei o código, mas sei que vai haver, portanto, podem também preparar-se para isso. E, sem mais demoras, eu diria que vamos começar. Laura, I think without further ado, I think we're going to start because it's 12 o'clock and we have to be weary of making the best we can of this 60 minutes. Let me just make this absolutely welcome to you. The huge thanks. We met together only last year in a jury, and it's been such a very productive interactivity in terms of learning formally and making connections that Laura is really on. And so she gave us this great opportunity to have her with us in 60 minutes. She's a very experienced colleague. She's been doing a whole lot of work, including founding a Center for Teaching and Learning and being the director of it. But she has done a number of positions in academics and as researcher, and teacher training. So she's a really well-known authority in this field, and she has really wonderful solutions that she is always eager to share due to her absolutely belief in open education resources in an equity perspective. So there's a lot for us to learn. We're having her from South Africa in name of myself, Manuel, Sandra, in name of all the people who are in Docência Mais. Laura, it's really a huge pleasure to have you. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Manuel. Thanks, Sandra. It's really great to be continuing a conversation that we began, as you say, last year, which feels like pre-COVID. When was that?
Podemos silenciar os microfones, por favor? Por favor. Por favor.
Thank you. So Manuel's asked me to look at the issue of digital inequalities, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on. And just to say that if you'd like to chat to me or tweet about what we're talking about, that's my Twitter handle there. And it's also the best way to communicate. And I certainly hope that this is a beginning of an ongoing conversation. But before I start, and before I launch into this conversation, I would like to ask you who are here today, when you think of teaching during the pandemic, what words come to your mind? So this is where I ask you to go to menti.com and use the code 2865736. So if you can do that, it will kickstart our conversation.
Sorry, Laura, could you show the code again, please?
Sure, of course. There we go.
I think it would be interesting to well, I wouldn't increase it to 4, but although there are, for example, the fMRI analyses,
Microfones podem...
the power analysis is based on a study that used...
Por favor, silenciar os microfones.
Oh,
Manel, desculpa, tu podes silenciá-los todos, acho eu. É mais fácil. Ou o anfitrião.
Silenciamos a Laura. Temos de lhe dar voz.
Okay, let's have a look what's coming there. Challenge, digital online excitement, technology, hard, challenging, wow. Too much asynchronous, okay, that's interesting. Struggle, innovation. Too many tools, demotivating, online, change, opportunities, availability, panic, yeah, panic, engaging. So it's really interesting. Challenge is right in the middle. Okay, opportunity, difficult. Wow. Okay. So the interesting thing I was wondering about is whether inequality was going to appear there. And I don't see it. Maybe it's there. Okay. So that's fascinating. I'm going to go back to our slides and just talk about inequality. So before COVID, inequality was the defining challenge of our time. This was something we knew already. And Sandra, this is a picture of a part of Cape Town. So here we have a very well-off rich area, and here we have an informal community. And if you were to think about the kind of digital capacity and digital capabilities and digital infrastructure that might be in that space, you can imagine the divides. So this was something that we knew, but what's happened with COVID that's so interesting is the wonderful Arundhati Roy, and I've included the link to this amazing teach-in, online teach-in that she ran called The Pandemic is a Portal. She spoke about how COVID-19 has been an MRI laying bare the social bones. And what she was talking about is how it exposed the cracks, how it exposed the inequalities that were always there already. And in fact, what's been so striking about COVID and this pandemic is that it's exposed inequality everywhere. Not so. South Africa is your kind of extreme case. Brazil, I met somebody earlier who's from Brazil. It's another extreme case. I've been there. It looks very similar. But in every country in the world, including the countries which apparently are much more equal, have better Gini coefficients, inequalities have been exposed as emergency remote teaching and learning has happened. And so I'm going to talk about three types of inequality. And here I'm using Thurborn's three categories of inequality, and I've provided the links there as well. Because what's very interesting about COVID is that three types of inequality coexist. And it's unusual because in higher education, we very rarely talk about vital inequality, which is socially determined distributions of health and in health and of lifespans. And it refers to life chances and survival rates. So it's human beings as organisms. And of course, it's relevant to higher education, but it's not normally discussed. And yet in the current context, it's being discussed a lot. Then there's resource inequality, which is where most of our attention generally lies, around the distribution of resources, rights and power, but also different types of capital. So social capital, economic capital, cultural capital, embodied capital, and so on. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about these. And then the third one, which is existential inequality, which is really around the kind of identity issues that have been so prevalent in education globally to date, and of course has gone online in the same way as everything else has. So this is about discrimination on the basis of being part of a particular group, Black, gender, disabled, etc. But it's also about representation, recognition, and respect. And these are, what's so interesting at the moment is that these are all coexisting. So what's interesting about vital inequality is we know that people from poor backgrounds are less likely to get into higher education. But now there's interesting research that shows that people who are educated live longer. And what's even more astonishing is that parents of college educated people live longer. So vital inequality lands up being particularly important at the moment because the tensions that all universities are facing are, What are the risks of students and staff being on campus? What are the risks of students not completing the academic year? So what are the risks if certain students fall out of the system? What are the implications for students from disadvantaged backgrounds, students who might never return? What happens to that stratification of the student body? And then, of course, what are the financial implications for universities? And for those of you who've been following what's going on in the United States, where universities are number one, closing, and number two, forcing students to go onto campus, the negotiation of those risks is turning out to be extremely difficult and contested. And from our point of view, as educators, how do we manage those risks? And we have to ask ourselves this before we get to talking about the things I'm going to talk about later. You know, how do you teach online? We have to ask, what are our risks about being on campus? Teaching our students who are not able to be on campus, meeting the insistence of the university to behave in a certain way. What are our responsibilities and our obligations? So that's the question about vital inequality. But before I go further and make any assumptions, I would like to ask you to go back to Menti and answer this question about barriers for students in your context. Because I can tell you about my context or what I read in the US, but if you can go back to Menti, and let me just move the slide for you. What is a barrier for you? And I'll go back to the Menti. What are the barriers for you in your context? If you can answer that, it will be helpful for a little bit of focusing the discussion from now. Okay, so this is very interesting, and I don't know how interesting it is for you, but the fact that access to connectivity is so primarily a top barrier is obviously going to affect all your planning and your design of everything you do as an educator, because it will mean that you're going to have to come up with a whole range of different strategies and understanding what does that mean in terms of access to connectivity. And that might mean access to Wi-Fi, it might mean access to broadband, it might mean there is access to connectivity, but it's impossibly expensive. It might mean poor access, so that certain like videos might not work, but other things can work. So that would need an enormous amount of interrogation from the point of view of planning for learning. The other interesting thing is that in your context, electricity is a barrier. So in my context, there are still parts of the country where there's no electricity, but I don't know whether you know that electricity is an issue where you are. I don't know whether you have times where there's power failures. So that's obviously relevant. And then access to device, capability, and digital literacy. Costs is a huge thing. In our context, we actually got the University of South Africa to negotiate with all the telecom providers to provide 0 rating. In other words, free data for educational sites. So we use the power of the university community and the whole sector to get free data. So this kind of information is absolutely essential, and I'm sure you've done it, to plan for your particular situation. Okay. So what can you do? Once you have a little bit of a sense of your situation, it's clear that you're going to have a multi-pronged strategy. And so designing for simply one context, everyone goes online, we simply put everything online, we have Zoom classes, is not going to work. It's not going to work for all your students. It's not going to work for people who have poor connectivity. And so the obvious thing, and I'm sure this is what many of you are doing already, the question becomes, how multi-pronged is it? Does it actually include print, for example? In our situation, we've given flash drives with content and we've couriered them on the basis that if Coca-Cola can get to any part of the country, then our devices with our laptops I teach at the top university in Africa, top 200 in the world. We sent 2,000 laptops to students in remote parts of the country. We bought and sent them laptops. So our assumptions about how disadvantaged our elite students were needed to be interrogated. And then it goes back to this question again, what's in an individual educator's control? What are you able to do? What pressure can you put on the system? What can you insist on? And that's something about being part of a university community. And then the last thing that an educator can do, and I think this is what Manuel really wanted me to focus on, is how to design your teaching materials with equity principles in mind. So the first thing is to be very mindful. Manuel, you've got all these slides, so you're very welcome to circulate them. And they did have a Creative Commons license on here. Is to understand the difference between face-to-face and remote. It's not the same. And furthermore, just as the same as you would have in class and out of class, you've got synchronous and asynchronous. So the very first thing that you have to bear in mind, if you're designing for a multi-pronged situation and you're designing for inequality, your focus must be on asynchronous. As soon as you design for synchronous, you're excluding people. And that is a particular set of principles, which is around readings, recordings, screencasts, simulations, and so on. And we could talk about that for a long time. And I'm going to ask you to tell me how much you want to talk about that. But what I will do is point you to a set of guidelines that we drew up in my center, which is basically low-tech teaching principles. And it's around do this and don't do this. So it's a matter of really owning and taking on these principles. And they, I'll run through some of them, but I'd rather see how much you want to talk about them. I think the umbrella thing is to keep it simple. So any notion of bells and whistles, high tech, fancy new technologies, this is not the time. This is the time to use what the students have, use what you as an educator are comfortable with, and keep it simple. Some other key points from here is communicate a lot. So students, we know from all the surveys and feedback that we get, they're anxious. So even if you don't know what you're going to do, write and tell them you don't have, you don't know, but keep communicating and run office hours. So in the same way that people would have an office hour in their building, have an office hour when students can get hold of you. Don't assume that you're available 24/7 because you're online. That's not taking care of yourself as an educator either. Yeah, so as I said, let's rather come back to this, but it's around being explicit, being structured. And some of these are quite difficult because the face-to-face environment leaves room for a lot of on the fly, decide the day before. And this is being clear up front and spelling out things. But I think you can have whole discussions just looking at how you enact this. And one of the things that, and this is Manuel, this is especially for you. Manuel, you wanted me to talk particularly around open education resources. So one of the things you can do is use legally available, freely licensed open education resources. And those of you who've been working with libraries are finding that the librarians are incredibly frustrated because they can't get books, actual paper books to people. The cost of ebooks, unfortunately, many commercial publishers have exploited the moment and are selling them for a ridiculous amount of money. But this is the opportunity to use open education resources or open textbooks. And what those are resources that are in the public domain or with an open license, which is free to use and adapt. And you'll see the license on the image, but you will also have seen it at the beginning of my slide presentation. So my slide presentation is available as an open resource, and all the resources that I'm showing you from the center that I run are available as freely open education resources, which means so that this do's and don'ts, you can translate it into Portuguese and you can adapt it. The only thing you have to do is attribute. So all open education resources licenses require attribution. And the license that we've made available is the most open, because those of you who are familiar with these licenses know that there are 6 categories from quite closed to quite open. And I'm not giving up my copyright. In fact, we're keeping our copyright, but we're giving permission for use. And what open education resources do is they address 2 forms of inequality. One is resource inequality. So this crazy idea of very expensive resources is taken care of because they're free to the user. And the other is existential inequality, because this question of representation is a real problem. So the kinds of materials that are available that represent a view or a version from America, which is not the reality that we've seen on the ground in our own contexts, means that they can be adapted for local use. And how do you find open education resources? 2 quick and easy ways. You can either go to the Creative Commons search engine, which is CC search, and you can search for images or whatever. They allow you to look for something you can use or commercially or modify and adapt. Or if you use Google, which I don't recommend generally for completely different reasons, which we can go into, you can actually go to advanced search and you can choose by, at the bottom of that, you'll see usage rights. And you can choose by Creative Commons licenses. So those are finding legally open resources in your sphere. As I mentioned, my center has developed a huge number. I think we've done about 85 resources on teaching online, not only about teaching on low tech and teaching on in inequitable circumstances, but also on how to teach in synchronous classrooms, how to help tutors, specialist considerations about postgrad, how to make screencasts, how to create a sense of presence in an online classroom. And those resources are all available at that link over there. And I'm not going to go through them all now, but they are there, and they are issues that you can use, because I really want to use the opportunity to have some more discussion. So I'm going to end basically with one last question. And this is an open-ended question, which I'm hoping we can use for a Q&A type of thing. And so I'm going to ask you to go back to Mentimeter and answer this question. What has been done? What have you been doing during the pandemic that is improving learning for all? Because it's, the focus tends to be on what's bad and what's problematic. but we have seen things that are improving learning and that we can take forward. One of the amazing things about this pandemic and its move to ERT is that we are focusing on teaching in universities in ways we've never done before. So what can we take forward? What can we share that we can take forward post-pandemic? So if you can do that, and I think I need to change the slide actually in here. Otherwise, it won't show up. There you are. What has been done to improve student learning that can be taken forward? Okay, we've got more innovation, open-mindedness. That's true. Strategies that people were not aware of and are now becoming expert on. More asynchronous. Manuel or Sandra, please can you help me with the Portuguese? Which you should be able to see from my screen.
Someone saying using a more diverse set of IT tools.
Right, and there's an interesting one, sharing resources. So that's a fascinating one, because traditionally individuals in face-to-face classrooms focus only on their own situations. And now we are actually seeing more collaboration, more interaction. That's interesting. People are seeing more interaction. Putting students at the center. Yep, I think that's right. I think people are starting to consider students' circumstances that have been invisible. Improved digital teaching, and of course that's important because everyone talks about I don't know, in Portugal, do you talk about the fourth industrial revolution? Here, everyone talks about the fourth industrial revolution. That's such an interesting one, more interaction with and between students. Isn't that fascinating? People talk about it being an alienating space, and yet people are saying there's more interaction. I'm hoping people will, we're going to open this up after this. I'm hoping we're going to get some elaboration. Schedule steps, so more planning, so less on the fly. More Zoom meetings. I'm not sure that's going to improve student learning. Okay, online evaluation. So I haven't seen assessment here yet. Because one of the things we're seeing in my university is that people have changed their assessment methods because they are very anxious about online proctored exams. And I'm hoping that that will lead to changed assessment forward. More proximity with students. This again. So this notion of distance is being challenged here. So there's more proximity. Improved student knowledge. Extended and flexible online office hours seems to be useful. I have to be careful about the impact on that on the educators. Okay, increased awareness of student inequalities. Teachers learning new skills. The possibility to record the classes. So that's something we have found students really value, that it helps for going over difficult materials. And certainly in our context, it's something that students are starting to demand. So if they have a class that's not recorded, they complain. More stage to the students, bringing the students to the forefront. Much more work. Yeah, it probably improves student learning, but the question about the impact on educators is irrelevant. And not only much more work, but perhaps much more unacknowledged or unrewarded work. Okay, online availability, recorded classes again. Being natural, that's interesting. That people feel able to be natural in the online sphere. Okay, more interaction. I'm fascinated by this. There's so much more of this. Okay, so I said that what I would do, I said to myself anyway, that what I would do is I would speak for half the time and leave half the time for Q&A. So that's my part of the presentation. And I'm going to stop this sharing now, because I'm hoping now that we can have some kind of a conversation.
Thank you, Laura. That was really, really interesting and useful, because you've talked about going from, you know, principles to actually things you can do, which is always valuable. And myself, I've seen things that I didn't know about. So that's really cool. Now, I think we can have two modes of participation. We'll be ending at 1 o'clock, so in 30 minutes exactly. So we have 30 minutes. So those of you who are more comfortable with chatting, please put your questions on chat. We will monitor them. Those of you who would really like to ask a question, it's really, the floor is yours. Just unmute yourselves and step up and ask. Is that okay, Laura?
That's great. And anything you or Sandra or anyone else would like to ask? I mean, for me, the interesting thing is what resonates, what doesn't resonate, what is particular to your context that I wouldn't know about that you are having to address. I don't know, for example, how much of an issue language is and how relevant that might be in the online sphere, you know, yeah. So let's just open it up for discussion.
Yeah.
So the floor is open.
Yeah, please raise your hand, because that would make it easier to manage this.
Okay. I don't see yet any hands being raised.
Fernando Rodrigues.
Fernando, oh, he's raising visually. I was looking at the virtual hand. I didn't see
Hi,
it.
Laura. Thank you for
Fernando.
a very nice webinar. I was wondering, and you brought that to light also, the assessment, the problem of assessment. Assessment in this reality is an issue. But also it opens, I think, new doors for formative assessment. What do you think about this?
Absolutely. I mean, as an educator, I think it's a wonderful opportunity. I really do. I think we've seen a range of different forms of assessment already happening during this period, because for us, the first semester ended with exams right in the middle of the lockdown. So we've seen open book exams. We've seen portfolios, so e-portfolios being used. We've seen long essays. There's been, so our bureaucratic system makes it very difficult to change the weighting of the exam. So once you've announced 6 months in advance, you're going to have an exam, then it's difficult not to. But we've seen people starting to plan to reduce the importance of the exam. And there's also been a lot of anxiety about proctoring. So
sorry, you said the reduced importance of the exam?
The exam, yeah, the exam as a method of evaluation. So instead of having an exam, having a portfolio.
So bring a lot of other things, ways of assessing to the
Exactly. And I think from an educational point of view, that's much healthier. Of course, it is more work. There's no question about that, you know, especially if you have a multiple choice exam. It's easy, it's quick, it can be marked by a machine. Whether it's the most educationally valuable is doubtful.
Yeah, but even so, I mean, the questions will be free afterwards. And that's an issue, because to produce a very good, high quality question, I mean, it's hard. And you can use them afterwards for monitoring the quality of your own exam.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think when I think of what might have a long-term impact, because so many people simply want to get back to the classroom, and this is inconvenient and unpleasant, and they want to go back. But one would really hope that people will see the value of formative assessment as a much more productive and valuable learning method for everyone going forward.
But this pandemic situation let us look at assessment in different ways. So I think it helped us to open our minds in what regards assessment. I mean, just not looking at it, just the exam, but I mean, broader our point of view.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Laura.
So as I don't see any hands raised, I'm just reading a comment from YouTube, which is a student stating that the fact that the information was released in the form of videos has made the possibility that students who work and study by peaks, so, you know, picking the study, really had better performances. That was a comment by a student.
And the interesting thing, just one comment about the videos, is that we, at the end of the first semester, we did a student survey of student experiences and a staff survey. And the students made it very clear they prefer shorter videos. So this idea that you can simply go online and reproduce your lecture was problematic. They like shorter chunks and they want more of them, and that works much better. And that, of course, is a mindset change for educators.
One of the mindsets, nobody's raising hands, please do. So one of the mindset changes that I saw first in your presentation was really to think of the asynchronous, right? And so there's the mindset change. And also, in my experience, there's also the big question of how much is this work going to count as teaching? Because if you're doing it asynchronously and you have X number of hours to teach, are you going to put those in? Of course not. Of course, yes. How do you deal with this? How do you deal with changing the mindset and actually addressing this difficult issue of counting?
That's a perfect question. And because what it speaks to is the regulatory frameworks. And so what we've really seen is that the regulatory frameworks are completely out of sync with new forms of teaching and learning. And if we talk about preparing for a digitally mediated future, whether you call it the fourth industrial revolution or not, the institutional policy frameworks are out of sync and the national policy frameworks are out of sync. So what it is actually forcing is a whole discussion about workload allocations. How do you calculate workloads? It's rethinking credit hours. I mean, I think there's a whole string of conversations going on everywhere about those kinds of questions. So you've completely put your finger on it. And nationally, in our context, we have face-to-face certification and accreditation, and we have distance. And this whole period has made a complete mockery of it. And the thing about those two categories is they are funded differently. So distance gets less funding. And what this has done is make all of that fall under the microscope. So I think, and this is where there's a real opportunity for collaboration, because we really need people who are in these kinds of positions who have to reassess credit hours and workload and so on, have to work together, because it's happening to everyone. And if you are serious about addressing students with barriers to learning, that's going to take more effort. How do you ensure that that's calculated into the workload and given proper recognition? So, I mean, I think that's your spot on there, Manuel.
It is. Your hand is up, so please come in.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your lecture and sharing your ideas and research, Professor. My question again has to do with assessment, and in particular with an issue that came up in my own experience last term, which was students' ethics. I mean, cheating.
Yep.
So I was not prepared to deal with that, and what I felt was that students themselves had to recompromise themselves with their ethics as students. I really would like to know what you think about this, because my own experience, I thought many times these students would need to be, let's say, we would need to help them rethink their ethics as students. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Of course, you've put your finger on one of the biggest issues that makes everyone very anxious. So the first thing I'll say is that student cheating has always happened, and students gamifying the system has always happened. The methods available to them and the affordances of the technology will change, but the real issue is actually to develop a developmental approach to a student engagement. And then I think, as you were saying, it links to the forms of assessment, because if you have forms of assessment that make it very difficult to cheat, you can get around that. And I think Fernando was saying how things can be, multiple choice questions can be made available, etc. It does. Yes.
So, I'm sorry.
No, please continue.
My issue has to do with the fact that my students deal with, or are supposed to do, more qualitative work than multiple choice, and for me it's rather difficult to develop multiple choice tests, very difficult indeed. And so I depend more on their thinking and ideas, the way they develop their ideas and come up with new ideas. So what I found is that some students do this, but some others cheat.
Well, all I can say, because I don't have 3 steps and here's student cheating solved, unfortunately. All I can say is that when I hear about humanities departments being closed in universities throughout the world, it makes me very anxious, because what you're talking about is ethics, critical thinking, the so-called soft skills that we are supposed to be inculcating in our students, where they understand what's really going on. And so it highlights the importance of the work that we're doing, rather than suggesting we should get rid of it, which doesn't make it easier, because people, especially senior decision makers, want easy answers, and I don't think there are easy answers. I see there's a question about collaboration.
There is, yes.
Yes.
How to see this, yeah.
So I'm not sure if the question means collaboration or means interaction. And one of the things that I was so intrigued by the answers that people were putting forward on the Mentimeter was how many people spoke about increased interaction. And it's quite fascinating, because it seems to shed a kind of light on the alienation of the current methods of large classes and big lecture theatres, where the academic is at the front and people don't actually talk to each other. And what we're starting to see is that the flatter spaces enables interactions in ways that the traditional material world doesn't. So there are a number of methods that can be used to build those kinds of forms of collaboration, which are techniques, which educators might be loath to learn, but they are certainly doable. And they are doable in small classes, and they're doable in big classes. I mean, something like this Zoom environment, you can make small rooms easily. You literally go to a button and say, allocate small rooms, put people in small rooms, have 6 people in a room, and then the next thing they're talking to each other. That's really difficult to do in a face-to-face environment. So there are, interestingly, a number of affordances of this technology that are more enabling, in fact. And certainly in terms of collaboration amongst researchers, one of the things that's been so interesting is how this kind of collaboration has become possible. I mean, Manuel, much as I'd like to come to Portugal, we are able to do this quite easily without any problem. And I can say to you, and I have a meeting in 10 minutes and it's not a problem. So we're actually seeing some great enriching possibilities through this, the affordances of the technology.
As I'm not seeing any other hands up, I'm going to try to focus on another issue that I find it's quite difficult nowadays. And it has always been, it's not only nowadays, but maybe nowadays it's a bit more difficult, which is the students who are more difficult to self-regulate. So students themselves really get worse. It's not a good word. Have more difficulties out of their peer sphere and their teachers' interaction and so on and so forth. Laura, what ideas, what solutions could you share with us to deal with this sort of issues?
Well, first of all, you're right, it has always been the case. But what's been interesting in this period, because students have had to go home to their home environments, what has become visible is the challenges of their home environments. So your way of describing it as students having the deficit, I'm going to challenge a little bit, because I think very often they are not in enabling home environments where it is possible to study. So I'm sure you all have examples and instances ranging from gendered relations in households where women students go home and they have to do more domestic work, they have to do more cooking, they have to look after younger siblings, they have to look after older people. Or they go home and they simply don't have an environment where it's possible to be in a learning environment. And that's, I mean, I heard a strange story the other day about proctoring software that insists on looking at the whole room that the student is in and banned a student from doing the test because the computer was on a pillow. But you have to ask, why was the computer on a pillow? So what I'm saying is that we have to look at what makes for an enabling environment for students. And in our situation, in our university, the government regulations allowed 33% of students to return. And we prioritized students with difficult learning environments to return. And we developed criteria for identifying the students with the most barriers, which I'm happy to share with you. So I suppose there's a more nuanced conversation about what creates agency for students.
But Laura, I guess that does not, it's of course associated with the learning environment at home, but not only. Many students do have difficulties in self-regulation, right?
Yeah.
And of course, those are not dissociated, but they may not come together. So
yeah. I mean, I think the other point I would make is there's a lot of value being shown to the first year experience.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I think that the initiatives that happen in a lot of places around first year experience, that's really the transition to the kind of learning you're expected to do in school and what's valued and actually rewarded and what is expected in a university context.
Like to condition them
exactly
in the right way. Yeah.
Yeah. And to reward and incentivize different ways of behaving.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I remember when my son came back from his first sociology class and he said, here is an assignment and it says, read this and discuss. And what am I supposed to do? You know, like teaching students what is meant and what is good behavior is actually needs to be made explicit. It's like a hidden curriculum. So I think that transition into what is actually required is what we're talking about.
Yeah, very much agree. Yeah.
So we're reaching, I think we're going to end in 5 minutes. So I'm going to ask those of you who might have like a final burning question, shout it out just after,
or disagreement,
or disagreement, to shout it out just now. And I'm gonna make a 3, 2, 1 count, and otherwise I'm gonna throw myself another question. So if you would like make a comment, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Apparently not. So I'm going to ask you, Laura, maybe the last question, because this conversation was also meant, and it was also about equity, and we've talked about a number of issues related to, for example, access to resources, right? But I'm also wondering about the usage of resources. So, for example, you sent flash drives to 2,000 students, right? And I'm sure some of them will be more IT prone, some of them will be, regardless of their enabling or disenabling environment, less IT prone. Now maybe we're going to have, in Portugal at least, we're going to now start the new year, and we are investing on a hybrid model, but mostly starting with the presential face-to-face teaching. And I'm thinking about equity issues within the classroom, or within the class, let's call room a big concept, within this classroom. What sort of ideas, what sort of suggestions would you have to actually do not prevent these students who might have more tech difficulties to actually be less left behind?
I mean, I think that the thing to do is multiple modes. So you were talking about flash drives, but there's still paper. You know, I don't think because we're talking about a 4IR, we should reject hard copies. And also, I don't agree with the notion of this neat thing of learning styles, but I do think multimodality is very helpful. So somebody was talking about the value of recording. I think transcripts is essential. So students being able to replay recording, but also have access to transcripts, to paper. I think your point is around multimodality and exploiting the possibilities of multimodality.
Would you go as far as multimodality in assessments? For example, giving the students some sort of a role in choosing, designing?
Oh no, that's a really interesting question. I haven't heard it done, but I don't see why not. Of course, I can hear the critics saying, how do you ensure equivalence?
Right.
And then there's also the question of language. So in our context, we have 11 official languages. So theoretically, you should be able to examine in any of those languages. But of course, the lingua franca is English. So, but I love that question. And I don't see why not. I challenge you to try it and tell us how it goes.
Okay.
I think it's a very good...
We will need to find volunteers with a very minded. I'm sure the spirit is among us. Then the issue is to being with all this extraordinary, within this all this extraordinary circumstances, taking such a bold step. But yes, let's find some volunteers.
Great.
I think that's a very good point, and a very heated discussion.
Yeah, it would be, wouldn't it?
But we really need not to avoid it and come to possible solutions, right? And an agreement between us. So Laura, and we know you have a meeting. No one else is asking for further questions. So thank you again very, very much.
It's a pleasure. I'm sorry we don't have time for a conversation because of the stimulating questions, and I haven't had a chance to ask you some provocative questions. But
true, that is true. Next time, and we really hope you will be able to come to Portugal. And
thank you.
And who knows, we will be able to go to Cape Town. We would love that.
That would be great. You're very welcome.
Okay.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank
you, Laura.
And thank you to all the participants. I really
exactly.
appreciate
Bye-bye.
it.
Thank you, Laura.
Bye-bye. Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Care.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
Well.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Laura. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.